But first of all, this morning we're going to hear from Mel Ainscow. Mel and I have worked together on the Scottish Attainment Challenge. He has been a great friend to Scotland and comes with a real international expertise around working to get the best for children and young people and families. Inclusion and equity are increasingly seen internationally as major priorities for the development of education policies and practices. And Mel's presentation will draw on his extensive experience of working with education systems in different countries to address the challenges involved. The use of evidence as a means of stimulating collaboration and experimentation is seen as a central strategy. And this has important implications for the contribution, of course, of educational psychologists. And Mel, I'm not going to embarrass you by reading your CV. I think we are really, understand that you have huge experience in this area. You've always brought a real added dimension to the discussions and debates in Scotland from your work all across the world. But just really happy to welcome you here as Emeritus Professor of University of Manchester and University of Glasgow, and of course Queensland University too. So just with no further ado, Mel, I'll hand over to you, and I know that your presentation will be really interesting and engaging for everyone that's here this morning. So thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you, Patricia, and it is a pleasure to be with you. I only regret that we're not all in one room together. The thought of 400 people in the room come together to talk about inclusion kind of blows my mind, really. But the regret I have is I often think when you're face to face, and I've done face to face things recently, of course, is you can see whether people are smiling at you or whether they're looking angry. Through this means, I don't know that I'll just have to hope for the best, really. Just to reiterate, as Patricia has said, I'm the least expert in terms of the situation in Scotland. Of course, I am involved a little bit through my work with my colleagues at the University of Glasgow, but I don't want to pretend to be an expert about what's happening in Scotland. That's what all of you are. As Patricia has said, what I'm going to do is talk about developments that I've seen in other parts of the world, not to tell you what to do. Be clear, I'm not coming with some kind of quick solution. You're all experienced enough to know that there is no quick solution. Rather, what I'm going to try to do is to use experiences elsewhere to stimulate you to think about your own experiences, your own work, to recognise the positives. And I know that there are lots of positives around the Scottish education system. I've had the privilege of seeing some of them. So those are the positives we need to build on. But as with every country of the world, there are still children we're not reaching, children we're concerned about. And of course, it's those children we're concerned about. But as Patricia said, I'm clear this is not a separate issue to the mainstream educational development issue. It is the issue that every country needs to address, and every country is trying to address because of global developments. Now, my colleague Jackie Ward is going to help me with the slides, I hope. So we'll put the title up if we can.
It's coming up, Mel. It's taking a wee bit to download, so we're almost there. If you want to just get started, it's coming up.
I mean, the other thing I thought was this morning was I love the title, All Our Children. That's the agenda, all our children. That's why this is core business. It's the core business of every teacher in every classroom. It's the core business of every school leader. It's the core business of the local authority. And of course, it's the core business of the Scottish Government, who undoubtedly have made what I'm calling inclusion and equity as being their priority. It's been there in all the policy statements over the last decade or so, really. So that's the agenda that I'm going to talk to. And I'm going to try to deal with these two questions. How can we promote inclusion and equity in schools? Because that's where the game is played, particularly in classrooms. So what I'm going to talk about, I hope, has got practical implications. But then towards the end, I want to talk a bit about policy, the implications for policy, but especially because the core group at the conference are the educational psychologists. But I know we have people from all other parts of the service, and I hope that what I have to say will be relevant to them as well. So be clear, I'm not telling you what to do. I'm saying these are my experiences. These are what made me think, and I'm still on the journey of understanding what's best in terms of moving education systems and schools forward. Still on the journey, as I'm sure all of you are really. So where should we start? let's go. Here we go. I hope. Let's go to Mumbai in India. Since 1990, the United Nations organizations have had a policy they call education for all. And I like that phrase because people like me tend to slip into jargon, which, if we're not very careful, confuses things. Now, here's what we're here to talk about. All the children, education for all. Now, since 1990, the United Nations has had a whole series of movements and documents, and they tried to push governments really to concentrate on the idea of education for all. I've been fortunate during those 30 years to work mainly with UNESCO, which is the United Nations organization most concerned with the development of education. And I've been involved in a whole series of initiatives and policy developments, which has given me the opportunity to go to many parts of the world. And I feel very privileged about that. Some time ago, one of my colleagues at the university described me as the Air Miles professor, because I spent so much time traveling around. Anyway, this photograph was taken some years ago in the city of Mumbai in India, and it illustrates something which is central to what I'm talking about. Currently, there are about 260 million children around the world today who are not in school. And they're not in school because there are no schools where they live, and there are no teachers where they live. Now, these children that you see in the photograph, these very young children, were part of that 260 million. And briefly, the story is that they live on what we would call a shanty town. In Latin America, they would call it a favela, a big part of the city made up of homemade houses. And what happened was there were a group of parents, in fact, significantly perhaps, a group of mothers, and they decided that they believed in education for all and they wanted their children to get an education. So what they did was they formed a group. They had the help of some local charity, I think. They collected some money, not very much money, and they built a school. Well, not a school, but a classroom, first of all. And the picture you see is of a classroom. Now, it doesn't look like a classroom in Scotland, I'm sure, I hope. But that's the classroom that they built. Very simple, very rudimentary. Standing in front of the classroom are the children who are going to school for the first time. And of course, like all children going to school, some are happy and smiling, some are looking less happy about what they're going to experience. But that's normal, isn't it, in anywhere in the world? Standing in the shadows are two women. One of the women is the chair of the parents' committee that built the classroom. Standing next to her is the teacher, because what happened was, once there was a classroom, the local education department provided a teacher. Now, I take two messages from this story, which is so far away from our experience here in the United Kingdom. The first message is to remind us, of course, how fortunate we are. Now, I complain about resources, I'm sure many of you do, but we have to remind ourselves that we are at the luxury end of global education in terms of the buildings we have, the materials we have, and most importantly, the human resources we have in and around our school. So our moral duty, of course, is to make sure we make the best use of those resources. Which leads me to my second message, which I take from this picture. The second message I take from this picture, and that is the key thing, as illustrated by these mothers, is we can have education for all if we want it to happen, and if we have the collective will to make it happen. And in a sense, that idea of the collective will of people coming together and saying, we're going to make sure all our children get an education, and indeed a quality education, and critically, we want to work together to make it happen. Now, that's my central message. And if you get bored with everything else I'll say, keep that in mind. This is about everybody working together to make sure that every child gets the chance of a quality education. So let me take you on a journey around the world. Let me take you some classrooms, and let me tell you the kind of experience that I had and what they made me think about, and what I invite you to think about in terms of your practice. Thank you. So fasten your seatbelts, because there may be some turbulence as we fly around the world, and some of the things I say may be somewhat surprising or maybe disturbing, but I hope they will, as they've done with me, make you think. Okay, the first stop then is to China. Some years ago, as part of my work with UNESCO, we developed a relationship with a research institute in Beijing. And on the first occasion I visited, I was welcomed, as I find I am in China. It's a very welcoming place and people are very hospitable. I was welcomed, and it was explained to me that as I went around, I would be introduced as a foreign expert. And I was given a little booklet in England, in English, a guide for foreign experts. And I remember thinking, this is a bit intimidating, the idea that I'm coming all this way from England and to be introduced to people in China as a foreign expert. Anyway, as is my custom when I do these kind of things, I asked to go and visit some schools and to look at some teaching and learning going on. And as you'll see, as I travel around, I take photographs. I'm not a very good photographer, so I excuse the quality of the pictures. But this was a picture in one of the first classrooms I looked at. But of course, the first thing that I saw in these schools, which were in the area around Beijing, was typically there were 70 children in the class. Now here I am arriving all that way, being introduced as a foreign expert and being introduced to somebody who will be able to give us advice about making our lessons and our schools more inclusive. And I'm thinking, well, typically I see 30 classes or less in the schools I visit in the UK, and rightly we complain about that. By European standards, that's quite high, in fact. So here I am faced with 70 children, and I'm thinking, what the heck am I going to say to these people that will be of any use to them at all? Well, what I decided to do, with the help of an interpreter, and interpreters have been an important part of my professional life, is I decided, of course, to observe and to listen and try to make sense of what was going on in the classroom. And what I found was that many of these Chinese teachers were absolutely brilliant at teaching in a way that engaged all these 70 or so children. And I started to think, what is it they're doing that's so effective? And one of the things they were doing, of course, was they were using questions. And typically they would ask a question related to the topic they were introducing, and often the children would answer in choral fashion, something that you don't see even today in our schools. But the idea is the children would all answer together. So already the sense of being inclusive. But then, of course, what happens, the teacher would ask questions and ask children to put up their hands. Next picture. And here was something interesting, you see. When the children put up their hands to answer the question, it was a salute. Now, I've observed this matter of details in different parts of the world. I spent some time, some years ago, in Romania in Eastern Europe, and there the children did this when they wanted to answer a question. And of course, when I'm talking to people in other countries, I say, well, in Scotland or the rest of the UK, we tend to do this, really. So they're just a simple thing that children do that in a different form in different parts of the world. But there in China, this kind of sense of military salute. I noticed then that the teachers would ask children to answer the question. And then, interestingly, sometimes they would ask the children who had not put their hand up. Now, here was a technique or even a trick, which was saying to children, you better be listening because I may ask you at any minute to answer the question. You know, this is not rocket science. This is not some new sophisticated technique for developing inclusive teaching and learning. But this was one of the techniques that these teachers were using. It did occur to me that possibly some of the children had worked it out and they put their hands up even if they didn't know the answer. But that's a bit cynical, really. In between the lessons, I got a chance to talk to some of the teachers, and they told me about other things. They explained, for example, that it was part of their tradition that children were expected to help one another. And what happened was that between the lessons and at lunchtime, groups of children would sit down and the more successful learners would help the other learners to keep up. And the teachers talked about keeping up. And they used, again, military terminology. We all have to march forward together. Now, of course, what I learned was that this idea of being responsibility for each other is a very strong part of the Chinese culture. And indeed, it's there across much of Asia. This idea that you're responsible for other people, of course, in your family, in your village, in your community, and at school. And of course, it's not part of our culture. It's not part of our tradition. By and large, we don't send our children to school to cooperate. We send our children to do well for themselves, and if possible, to do better than the other children. So here's where local culture is a factor. Just an aside, in relation to Asia, if you go in McDonald's in Singapore, the only reason you would go in McDonald's in Singapore because they have very good coffee. You'll see around the walls there are signs saying no studying. Now, I don't think they have in the McDonald's in Edinburgh or Dundee or wherever. I don't think in your McDonald's you've got signs no studying. The reason they have those signs is because, again, young people go in the evening and meet up and do their homework together. They help one another. And many of them live in very cramped apartments. So they go to McDonald's or they go to the railway station or they go to the library if there is a library and they work together. So there is that strong tradition. So what I took from that experience, which was a quite important shaping effect on many other things I've done subsequently, was the first of my lessons. That as far as moving a school forward, moving practice forward in the school, moving the system forward, if you will, the starting point, in my view, should be with what already exists. It's not about bringing things from elsewhere. I'm not opposed to that, but that's the cream on the cake. The cake of professional development, the improvement of teaching and learning, making a teaching and learning more inclusive, is by building on what's there in the school. And my experience tells me that always, and I underline that, always, there's more skill, more knowledge, more creativity lying latent in schools than is being used. So this for me is a kind of, it shapes everything else I'm going to talk about. That when I'm working with schools, as I do, I emphasize the idea of making better use of the expertise that's there by moving knowledge around within the school and moving knowledge around between schools. So everything else I'm going to talk about is based on that premise, and obviously it has implications for all of you to think about. Do you agree with that? And if you agree with it, is that the basis of what you're doing in relation to your efforts to support inclusive school improvement? Okay, let's move on. Let's go to Ghana in West Africa. So different to the scene in Beijing. This is a village school on the coast of Ghana, which is on the equator, so it's hot all year round. The facilities are extremely primitive, as you can see. The class numbers are much smaller, interestingly. The furniture is simple. In fact, I saw some of the children bringing chairs in the morning. They carried them on their heads and they took them home in the evening because there wasn't enough chairs in the school. There are no windows as such. There are kind of holes in the wall, as you see. And if there are visitors, then particularly a visitor with a white face, then people from the local community come and have a look to see what's going on. So the sense of the school and the community in this village is very close. If you can see the picture closely, you might notice there's one girl who is obviously quite a bit older than the other children. I only realised it later. I didn't get round to ask the question, but I assume she was either resitting the grade, which is a very dangerous thing to do in my view, or it may be that she's just moved into the area and the teachers decided to put her with these young children. I asked the teachers, you know, how can we help? I'm coming from UNESCO. What can we do to help you to improve your work? And one of the teachers said to me, well, if you could provide some textbooks. And he explained that he only had one book for every lesson. And so he would read the lesson, the part of the book he wanted to use the night before. Maybe he would put some extracts on the blackboard, and then he would actually work in that way. And he said, if I could just have, say, a book that maybe 3 children could share. And I'm thinking, well, in this unfair world, what is this about? You know, what did it cost to fly me from the UK to Ghana? How many books would that have bought? You know, these are kind of moral things that you're left thinking about, really. Thank you. As I went around the school, I saw this pupil. He obviously has some kind of quite severe, I think, physical impairment. His father has made him a stick so that he can walk into the classroom. I asked the teacher, how is it that this boy comes to your school? I don't think he could quite understand the question, so I asked it again. And he said to me, where else would he go? You see, I was asking the kind of European question, really, because in many of our countries in Europe, it could be that at one time, certainly, a boy like this might have gone to some kind of special revision into a unit or a school, whatever. But clearly, this is the village school. All the children go to the village. All the teachers live in the village. There is a sense of collective responsibility. And so differences are something which are rather accepted as being part of normality, really. And I said to him, well, are there some difficulties with this boy? And he thought for a while. He said, well, sometimes it's difficult in games or physical education. He said, but the other children help him. The other children help him. So I think there's something about how we view differences, some of our thinking and the lessons of our previous experience, which we have to address. So that brings me to another lesson. That we have to think about how we view differences. Are differences amongst the children, and indeed differences amongst our colleagues, are they a problem to be fixed? But if they can't be fixed, taken away? Or are they in fact a stimulus to innovation, an invitation to think about what else can we do to reach the children we're not reaching at the moment? And in that way, differences then become a positive part of what we're doing. So this is about attitudes and thinking, values and beliefs, all those things which guide our action in the field. Okay, fasten your seatbelts again. We're going to Europe. We're going to Vienna in Austria. It's just before Christmas, and as you can see, there is thick snow and it's still a beautiful blue sky there. I'm visiting a school there with a group of colleagues from UNESCO, again, to look at what's happening about notions of inclusive education. The situation in the classroom is quite different again. Thank you. Now there are, I think, 16 to 18 children in the class. Look at the resources, the equipment, the furniture. This really is luxury schooling of the sort that all of our children should be entitled to. The teacher is explaining to the children that in preparation for the Christmas break, they're going to make calendars, which they're going to take home for their families. And she talks about calendars and why they're significant. And then she sets them working on preparing the calendars. Sitting at the back of the room on his own at a desk is a boy. This boy has been designated as having special educational needs under the national policy. As a result of that designation, he is provided with an additional teacher. So in fact, there are two teachers in the classroom, the main teacher and what might be called the support teacher. As we watch the lesson, most of the time, the boy is given instructions by his support teacher. And in fact, sometimes she stands in front of him so that he's not listening to what the other teacher is saying, and he's certainly not interacting with the other children in the classroom. So this policy of providing a support teacher, in our country, it might more likely be a support assistant, but the idea of an additional adult is there to foster inclusion. And in a sense, this boy is included. He goes to the same school, he goes to the same classroom, but then when we look carefully and listen, is he really included? Or is this a form of segregation in the mainstream classroom? And of course, it raises the question of what else could happen? How would it be if these two teachers were team teaching, were planning a lesson to make sure that all the children, including this boy who has been categorized, could be part of a common experience, so that he could learn from both teachers, so that he could learn from the other children, which he's obviously missing out on, and also so that he could contribute to what's going on. So what I'm suggesting is forms of segregation, if I might use that rather emotive word, can be quite subtle and can create barriers for some of our learners. So this leads me to my third lesson. as we move forward in trying to develop more inclusive schools and classrooms, we have to be concerned with barriers. This idea of barriers as a kind of metaphor, and it's been widely used in the international policy developments. It was originally introduced by a school review instrument that I was involved in the 1990s called the Index for Inclusion, where we introduced the idea of barriers as a way of thinking about what you need to do to move practice forward. Now, barriers can take many forms. In the example I've given, I'm suggesting that unintentionally, the extra teacher is a barrier. The curriculum can be a barrier if it's not designed with all children in mind. The assessment systems we use can provide barriers if they don't celebrate the progress of all children, some of whom are making quite slow progress in comparison with the others in the classroom. Of course, our teaching methods can be barriers if we don't know how to manage and plan and orchestrate a lesson where every child can feel that they're going to benefit from what's going on. Some of the most difficult barriers, of course, are the barriers in our minds. If we don't believe it's possible that all children can participate and learn together, then it's unlikely we're going to make it happen. Now, these are subtle barriers. They're difficult to identify and they're difficult to overcome. And so they can be quite significant in terms of attempts to move thinking and practice forward with it in the school. Now, be clear, I am not talking about barriers within children. That's the old thinking. It's there in the minds of all of us because we grew up with that idea that notions of, we used to talk about integration and inclusion, are about fixing some children. And if they can't be fixed, as I said earlier, be taken away. My background is in the world of special education. I was a special school teacher. I was a head teacher of a special school as well. So I'm rooted in that kind of tradition. But what the last 30 years has gradually taken forward is a fairly massive global debate, and it's gone on in our country as well, about how to think about this task. And I think addressing contextual barriers is the kind of major shift in thinking that we have to achieve if we're to move thinking and practice forward. Excuse me. Okay, with that in mind, let's go somewhere else. We're back in Asia. This is a classroom in the city of Vientiane, which is the capital city of the small country of Laos. Laos is a quite isolated socialist country. It's trapped between Vietnam, Cambodia and Thailand, and has been until very recently very isolated. And on this occasion, when I first visited there, it was certainly quite difficult to get into the country. I'm watching a lesson taught by a young male teacher, and he explains that the lesson is going to be about the nature that exists even in the city where they live. And the night before, he had drawn a picture where he'd shown the birds, the trees, the plants and so on. And he used this picture to illustrate the argument that he was going to put to the children. So for the first 10 minutes of the lesson, it was him talking. And then after 10 minutes, he put a question on the board and he said to the children, I want you to go into your groups. Immediately, they turned around and started talking. It was clear that they had done this many times before. He didn't give them any detailed instructions. They just got on with it because that was part of the normal practice. Thank you. Immediately, the classroom was transformed. This place where children were sitting silently, listening, or maybe not listening, understanding, or maybe not understanding, became a place of active learning. Look at the faces of these pupils. Look at their body language. They're engaged together in a learning task, which is becoming meaningful to all of them. One of the boys has a pen and he's writing the notes of what they're discussing so that he'll feed them back to the rest of the class later during the lesson. Now, this experience, like many others I've had in some of the poorer parts of the world, points to the creativity of many teachers. this idea of children working together, we call it usually cooperative group work. It's not new, of course, and we have in the West massive research about it. Now, this teacher didn't know anything about that research. He wouldn't find it because the country is so isolated. But through his own creativity and his own commitment to make the lesson inclusive, he realised that at certain times in the lesson, the possibility of children talking together will make the learning environment much more inclusive. Now, what the Western research says is if teachers are skillful, underline that, if teachers are skillful at using this kind of cooperative group work appropriately at particular moments during a lesson and with appropriate materials, if teachers are skillful, then you're going to get improved outcomes in 3 areas. It's going to raise standards, as politicians talk about. The children are going to learn more. It's going to improve behaviour because children are learning how to behave together. And perhaps most significantly, it's going to improve self-esteem because the children are valuing each other and learning that differences that they have can be of value to them. Now, all of that is about mainstream school improvement. But then there's another body of formal research in the West coming from a different angle, which comes to the same conclusion. This research is about notions of inclusion. It's about, for example, what do you do for children who've come from another country or have been away from school through illness, or children who've been in some kind of special provision and are being reintegrated? What is the best way of doing all of that? And the research comes to more or less the same conclusion. It says that if you want to integrate an individual, you need to put them in a classroom where this happens. If it's a classroom where children sit alone on their own, working individually all day, then the newcomer is going to find it very difficult to participate and become part of the social milieu of the classroom. So here again, we come back to the idea that strategies for inclusion are going to make a benefit, be a benefit to all the children. Inclusion and equity, the pathway to excellence. Okay, so the lesson from that is, reiterating what I said at the beginning of this talk, this is about making use of available resources, particularly human resources, and the children themselves are a fantastic resource. We've only scratched the surface, I think, even in the UK, of making use of the voice of children, of course, but also their active contribution and sometimes even their leadership. And I think we have to think more about the use of human resources. Okay, we're going back to India. The first time I went back to India, as has been my custom, I fall into a trap of going with some expectations of what I will see based on some half-baked knowledge I've picked up from somebody or something I've read. And so when I went to India, I had this expectation that the schools would be extremely full, that the children would be sitting silently in rows, and that the teachers would be doing most of the talking. I was taken to this government school in a quite poor area of New Delhi, the capital city, and I was given the chance for a day to spend time in classrooms. In this particular classroom you're seeing, the children were doing a project about the role of family members. It was a role play lesson, in fact. And having given the instructions, the teachers asked the children to work in groups. And in the groups, people took different roles: father, mother, grandparents, brothers, sisters, and so on. And they did some kind of problem-solving task. It was extremely noisy, I have to say, but it was very active. It was clear that, as far as I could see, all the children in the class were active in engaging in this discussion, which they were also enjoying. At a point in the lesson, the teacher asked them to stop and be quiet and sit down, and then she orchestrated a discussion. Thank you. She got the children to tell, the next picture please. She got the children to tell one another what they had been learning in this role play. So here was another example of a teacher in a relatively poor part of the world who probably didn't have contact with the Western research, but again, through her own creativity, had seen the value of, in this case, role play, and in this case, the value of children becoming teachers. The children are actually teaching each other. Now, again, we've got Western research which talks about the value of this, a form of overlearning, if you will. During the day, I had a chance to have a meeting with some of the teachers, and I came clean. I explained how I was rather surprised about what I'd seen, because I saw lots of different kinds of active learning around the school. And I said, how was it that this had come about? And they explained that about a year previously, a new head teacher had arrived. They referred to her very, very politely, I think, as Madam. And they said, when Madam came, she introduced this new policy where once a month, on a Saturday morning, we come back to school for what they called workshops. So they come back to school for workshops. Now, I'm not sure the idea of coming back to school on a Saturday morning would be that popular in Scotland. So I'm not wanting to sell that as an idea. But the workshop idea clearly is significant. Next picture. I was fortunate to be able to attend one of these workshops. And what I saw was a discussion led by the head teacher with the assistance of a researcher from a local research institute, where they were talking about methods for reaching the children who were hard to reach. All around the school were posters. Thank you. These posters were a record of the Saturday morning workshops. In this case, the two women, the woman in the red sari is the head teacher, and the other woman is the researcher from the local institute. Now, there's so many lessons in this experience which I took away. I mean, first of all, the idea of the workshop, a chance for practitioners to talk to one another, to share ideas. We still don't do enough of that. Remember what I said, the expertise that's there in the school, we have to move it around. We have to find time to talk about practice. Also, a lesson here, the role of the head teacher. She's just not talking about let's improve the school. She's actively involved. She's leading the workshop. She's showing that she's committed to the importance of teaching and learning. The teacher said, we've realised there are other things that you have to do to develop better practices. And they said, for example, one of the things we do is we occasionally work together in pairs. And they said, because what we've realised is when you're trying something out, it's really helpful if you've got another adult there to work with you. And I said, well, okay, how do you do that? How do you find time? And they said, well, it's difficult. And they said, sometimes Madam comes and she will take one of the classes to release the teacher to work with their partner. And again, you see, this head teacher, she is, you know, a true leader. She doesn't just talk the talk, she walks the talk. She's there, making it happen. The teacher said, but that's not sufficient, you know, because Madam is very busy and it's a very big school. That doesn't solve the problem. So sometimes, she said, sometimes what we do is we put two classes together so that we can team teach. I said, I don't understand how to do that. You've got 45 children in each class. You've got these very crowded classrooms. How can you put two classes together? And they said, well, what we do is sometimes we take the children outside. And I was lucky again, because while I was there, I saw an example of this. Next picture, please. I saw an example where two classes were working together with the two teachers, doing some kind of group exercise, as you can see, where the children were learning together and from one another, but also the teachers were learning together and from one another. So a form of professional learning going on in the school through planning together, through observing one another and talking about practice and sharing ideas within the school. I've used this photograph quite a lot, and on one occasion fairly recently somebody said, have you noticed something about the groups? And you'll spot there seems to be girls groups and boys groups. Now, I didn't spot it at the time and I don't know the answer to the question, but was this the choice of the children, or was this tradition, and was this what the teachers were asking them to do? I simply don't know. But from this visit, I draw a lot of lessons which I've used subsequently in other work here in the UK. It seems to me to move practice forward in a more inclusive direction, You have to invest in the learning of the adults as well as the children. You've got to create moments like the Saturday morning workshop where teachers talk about practice and develop a language of practice so they can share ideas. You see, I watch lots of teachers working, and if I can, after the lesson, I sit down with a teacher, I'll say, now, be clear, I'm not an inspector. This is not performance management. I'm just trying to understand your practice. And then I go through my notes and I say, this is what I saw you do. I heard this, I saw this. And when I do that, particularly with very experienced teachers, they express surprise. And they say, I don't remember doing that. Did I do that? And of course, what it reminds people like me who live in the twilight zone of the education service, in case we forget, how demanding being a teacher is, how intensive the day is. There is no time to think. There is no time to talk. And so colleagues, even very experienced colleagues, find it very difficult to explain what they do. That's a barrier. If we can't explain what we do, how are we going to share ideas? How are we going to move knowledge around? So there's a big question here in terms of the leadership at the school level to create that time and the relationships where the kind of sharing that we saw in that classroom in Delhi is going on, and where, you know, there are opportunities to see one another working. For those of you as school leaders, I would say this to you. If your colleagues don't occasionally have an opportunity to see one another teaching, you're not getting the best out of your workplace, your workforce. You're not getting the best out of it. You have to invest in their learning. Sometimes when I say that, when I'm doing workshops with groups of head teachers, somebody will say, well, I agree with you, Mel, but the trouble is we haven't got time. And I say, well, you don't agree with me. Time is the currency we use to decide something's important. There is no time. But if there's something important, we find time. If you believe, as I do, that investing in the learning of adults will pay off in the learning of the children, you will find time. And I'm sure there are teachers and head teachers in this meeting who do that and who find the time. And of course, what that does is has an impact on the culture of the school. It becomes a place of inquiry, a place of innovation, to try to find new ways of reaching the learners we're not reaching at the moment. Right, we're on the last step of our journey, and we're coming back to the United Kingdom. I'm working at the moment with a partnership of schools in the city of Bradford. The policy context is so different to Scotland, but as we've seen around the world, schools are schools, classrooms are classrooms. The schools in this particular network have set themselves up in what they call learning threes. Each school belongs to a trio. And one of the things they've been doing to collaborate is they've been doing mutual visits, a form of what I call peer inquiry. Sometimes people call it peer review. And I had the privilege of joining two school leaders as they spent a morning in the third school, finding out about what the school does. The agenda was set by the whole school. This is what I want you to look at. And then the visitors, including me, spent time wandering around the school, observing lessons informally. Thank you. Talking to children, hearing the voice of the children, and seeing what was going on around the classrooms. Thank you. At the end of the morning, the school leaders, the three school leaders, met together, and I was there as sort of a fly on the wall, if you will, although I chipped in, of course. And they talked about what they'd seen. They talked about how looking at another school was like a mirror, made you think about your own school. In the same way I've just implied about teachers seeing another teacher, that is a mirror. Seeing another school at work is a mirror. There was a wonderful moment during the discussion where one of the school leaders said, I noticed that in your nursery classes, most of the children never speak unless there's an adult there. I should explain, these schools are serving extremely disadvantaged communities in the city of Bradford. And that's what she said. She said, I noticed the children don't speak unless there's somebody, another adult. They just get on with what they're doing. And she said, that's what happens in my school. I hadn't thought of it. And then they went on to have a great discussion about the need to stress oracy in the curriculum of the school. So that's my final lesson, really, that I think as well as moving knowledge within the school, we've got to create partnerships, clusters, networks, whatever, to move knowledge around between schools. And I think there's a lot of strong, from my visits, there's a long tradition in Scotland of school groupings, but I still think more could be made of them and more could be done to make them effective for moving practice around. So in summary, I've offered 6 ideas which interconnect, which form the basis of what I think needs to happen to move thinking, policy and practice forward. Let me then conclude by just saying a little bit about policy. I should say, in relation to that thinking, I recently, as part of my work with UNESCO, we've developed a resource pack of professional development materials called Reaching Out to All Learners, based on these kind of experiences. They're freely available in different languages on the website that's there. But they're meant to be used for school development, but they could also be used in professional development courses or even in service courses and so on. So they've been designed, obviously, to be used internationally. So let me say a little bit about policy. In 2017, I worked with an international group of experts on behalf of UNESCO to develop a policy guide called A Guide for Ensuring Inclusion and Equity in Education. And it provides a framework for reviewing education systems, and it has lots of examples from different parts of the world to illustrate the kind of things that need to happen. A key outcome of that process, which is there in that guide, which you can get freely on the UNESCO website, was this motto, which I think has now become quite widely used internationally through UNESCO: every learner matters and matters equally. Now, for me, that's crucial. We have to have a definition of what we're trying to do. And I think that principle, every learner matters and matters equally, is a very accessible framework for thinking about how to move policy and practice forward. So what about changing policy? The international research on educational change is quite depressing about changing education policy. It's quite clear that changing policy at the school level and at the system level is extremely difficult. This is the dominant approach to policy change internationally. Politicians come together in a way that they should do and rightly do, want to do their best for all the children in their countries, and with the help of experts, they develop a policy. That policy is then sent through a kind of machine that is passed down and eventually arrives at the head teacher, whose job it is to implement the policy. It's simple, it's straightforward, it's rational. The only thing is, it doesn't work. It simply doesn't work. And politicians find it difficult to understand why it doesn't work. They do their best, they want things to happen. Of course, they're driven by timescales because there's an election coming and they want to show they've got results. But as a result, implementation of policy is often a weak link in my experience. So what do we know about educational change? What does the research tell us? First of all, policy is made at all levels of an education system, not least at the classroom level. This is what can you just leave them one by one? This is what policymakers find it difficult to understand, and I appreciate their frustration. They do their business, and then they're frustrated that things don't change. But it's because of this complexity of levels. And of course, the crucial level is the classroom level. Teachers are policymakers. As far as the children are concerned, it doesn't matter what the Minister of Education says, or the Director of Education in the local authority, or the head teacher. The teacher is the policymaker. When she closes the door, as far as the kids are concerned, they have to understand, appreciate, and value the policy. And if they don't, it won't happen. So whatever else we have to do is to bring about change, we have to invest in teachers. And the most successful education systems in the world, a feature of them is they invest in the professional development of teachers and the involvement of teachers in policy discussion and implementation. Secondly, it therefore can be said that educational change is technically simple. I've come up with 6 ideas today. I'm sure if this 200 people got together, we could come up with even more sophisticated sets of ideas. It's not that difficult to say what needs to happen. It's the social complexity. And this is the challenge to those of you who are in leadership positions. You have to bring people together and you have to get a common understanding of what you're trying to achieve. Thank you. So therefore, clarity of purpose is essential. And if we use terms like inclusion and equity, we've got to define them. That's why I'm attracted to phrases like every learner matters and matters equally. That's what we're trying to achieve in this country, in this local authority, in this school. You need some kind of headline that people can identify with. Thank you. You then need evidence. And evidence can take many forms. Obviously, the starting point is almost always statistics. And statistics are very helpful as a starting point because they show patterns. They show who is included, who is missing, who is attending, who's not attending, who's making progress. But like all research evidence, every method has its strengths and its weakness. Statistics tell you what things look like. They show patterns, but they don't tell us why. And if we want to intervene, which we do, we need to know why. So you need different kinds of evidence. You need intelligence. That's why observation is so important. That's why listening to people, particularly the voice of the children themselves, is so crucial as a potential catalyst for change. So I'm describing a process of development which is social, evidence-based, inquiry-based. Now then, just by way of conclusion, I wanted to say a little about what I think this might mean for those of us who work outside the system supporting schools, particularly the educational psychologists. But I think this has implications for all of us, I include myself, who work to support schools. And of course, we all have statutory responsibilities, and I don't underestimate that those are, of course, are important to you. But I think if you follow the argument that I put forward this morning, there are certain things that we can do. First of all, we can encourage an inquiring stance so that actually the school is a place of inquiry, research, investigation, action research, whatever words you want to use, where people are constantly collecting and engaging with evidence to say, what else can we do to reach the children who we're not reaching at the moment? Secondly, I think we can provide technical advice sometimes on how to generate that evidence. I'm talking about collecting the views of children, for example. Well, it's quite a difficult thing to do, but there is expertise around. And then the question of how the evidence we collect can be analysed. Then, all of this requires action. And the feature of schools that make progress in relation to inclusion is they become collaboratively problem-solving organisations. Places where people are not left alone to solve problems, but they know they can turn to their colleagues and that they'll get help and advice. Now, I think sometimes outsiders can facilitate all of that. Thank you. Implicit in all this is a role that's sometimes called a critical friend. Be clear, when I say critical, I don't mean somebody who's going to come along and criticise, but rather somebody who comes along and acts as a catalyst, asks questions, raises issues, stimulates discussion, stimulates reflection, and so on. And then finally, of course, I think those who go to a school have a moral duty to act as the champion of children and their families, to make sure that the collaboration that's going on has not become collusion to overlook the children who are always being overlooked. And I think, again, I think outsiders have a role to play in all of that. So then, finally, go back to Mumbai, go back to the beginning. The most important thing well, I think there's a problem with this. Oh, there it is. The most important factor, the collective will to make it happen. Okay, I welcome your thoughts, questions, criticisms, if you like. Got a few minutes now for discussion.
Thank you so much, Mel. I can get feedback here. There's some questions in the chat pane, and there's so many comments as well, Mel, which is absolutely fantastic. apologies for not turning your slides as soon as I knew you were looking, because I was trying to write notes, and it was like you were really making me think. So I'm so glad this has been recorded, because I'm going to be able to go back and listen again. But yeah, you really made me think, and I think, like Donna, I loved that time is the currency we use to decide something is important. I think that resonated with a lot of us. George, you've got your hand up. Do you want to come in?
Yes, thank you very much. No, that was really useful. I'm a counsellor in Dumfries and Galloway. I was vice chair of the education committee, and one of the many challenges and risks that we have is inclusion and exclusion, and we're trying really hard to get an understanding of what inclusion and exclusion is. The stats that what we collate often, if you like, boastfully say we've reduced exclusion from 10% to 8%, and they ask what's happened to the kids that are excluded and the ones that are on the edge of exclusion. How are they being included, and what is the impact on other children? My daughter's doing professional education at Stirling University. She's just done a paper on inclusion, and the real question was, what is inclusion and what is exclusion? And I have to agree that it's non-binary, but it's very difficult. Our local authorities try really hard, because there's a small cohort of children that are excluded because they have autism or anxiety and things like that. And how do we include them, whether in education or in the schools, or a bit of both? Because some of these children have real difficulty into school. I would love them to be into school, but at the meantime, their education is stalling. So it's finding the imaginative, innovative resource to accommodate all children that have got these problems.
Yeah.
I hope that's there's a question in there sort of garbled.
That's all right. No.
It's really the difficulty in
it's a very important comment. Thank you very much. And of course, I do recognise the importance of the local authority and politicians in all of this, in acting as the kind of conscience of the system to make sure we are not colluding to overlook some children. There are dilemmas, clearly. I mean, I'm talking about long-term development, and it is long-term. And of course, the situations that head teachers and teachers face, they face today and have to deal with very difficult situations. And I always say, well, let's trust the practitioners. They know the children best. They know the situation best. You made me think as well about saying a bit more about the definition of inclusion. The way I've defined it through all these experiences is to see it as a process, or you might say a journey. In other words, it's not a state. Is it an inclusive school or is it not an inclusive school? The implication is that it's a process, means that every school is to some extent inclusive. But where next? Because it's a process and a journey, where next do we go to make our schools more inclusive? And when I've worked with schools, as I have done sometimes, that are well down the road, and I've said to them, you know, I'm arranging some visits here because you're an inclusive school. Many times people said to me, don't describe us as an inclusive school. We're committed to it, but we're not there yet. And of course, that's right. You're not there yet because there are always new children who come along who present new challenges. One of the great experts that I worked with a long time ago, a guy from New Zealand, Keith Ballard, he said, you'll never have an inclusive school. It's an impossible thing. It's a dream. It's an image, really. And I think that's kind of liberating, really, because it makes you think, you know, we are all on the journey. And the question is, how do we move further along the journey? And the kind of ideas that I put before are suggestions based on experience that seem to be helpful. But as I said right at the beginning, there are no quick fixes. And as I said there, I want to underline, ultimately, I trust the professionals to do their best to make the best decisions.
Within the chat, we've got a few questions, and then we've got another question that's Kirsty's going to ask. But we've got one here from Sally Mel. It's saying, do you think that additional resources can sometimes be a barrier to inclusion?
Well, I guess my story from Vienna illustrated that, because if we're not careful, it becomes a dependency thing. There's nothing we can do unless we've got extra resources. And I, you know, take you back to Mumbai, you know, there couldn't be less resources than they got there, you know. So I think that can be, you know, I'm all in favour of more resources, no doubt about it. But I think if we're not careful, that can be a cul-de-sac, that we spend our time trying to get more resources, when in fact, as I said in my talk, we're in one of the most luxurious education systems in the world. The resources we've got are phenomenal. We've got to use them more creatively. We've got to bring people together. That's why the issue of leadership, my friend in New Delhi, her leadership in action, I think, is an inspiration to all of you who are in leadership positions.
I think that's sort of the follow-up question that Alison's asked in the chat pane. Are we using the resources we do have in the most inclusive manner?
Yeah,
I think that's a good one as well.
It is really, and that's why I'm very committed to the idea of school-to-school support, because I think colleagues coming from a partner school, not to inspect you, not to pick holes in what you're doing, but to learn from you. But they will also make you think, because outsiders remind you of things you've forgotten or draw your attention to things that you've stopped seeing. So I think the potential for between school developments is absolutely crucial. The colleagues from Dundee who are here will know that with my colleagues at the University of Glasgow, we're working on a project in Dundee which is called Every Dundee Learner Matters. And the Dundee schools are working in school improvement partnerships and using peer inquiry methods to learn from one another. And we're already seeing the benefit of that. But I know there's a lot more of those kind of things happening across Scotland.
Yeah, that definitely came through, that the power of peers as well, which was great to see, especially with sort of Scotland's incorporation, hopefully, of UNCRC across the board. But we've got Kirsty with her hand up as well, and we've got 3 minutes left now. Kirsty, do you want to come in with your question?
Hi, I'm Kirsty Rees from East Renfrew Educational Psychology. I just wanted to ask you a question. I think one of the biggest barriers for us as educational psychologists, and for all of us actually, and it was mentioned by yourself and by Bernadette in the chat, is imposed at a cultural level in terms of the fact that we live in a very individualistic society, and the real focus on attainment in the form of exam grades, and that can lead to real conflicting and competing demands for education staff. It's something I think that we try to make explicit in our profession, but it's very hard when you're battling against that, and when teachers are trying their best, I suppose, to include children, whilst at the same time they've got a lot of pressure in terms of attainment. I just wondered if you think that there is a shift in that area, or if you think there's anything more we can do to really promote that.
I mean, it's a really important point you've made, and that's why I keep stressing, that this is not another project. This is the project. Sometimes when I'm working with the government people, I say to them, don't have a policy for inclusion. Because if you have a policy for inclusion, that means it's somebody's job, and we'll delegate it to them. Inclusion is not a policy, it's a principle, and it should inform all policies, the curriculum, assessment systems, inspections, funding, teacher education. Everything should be driven by the same principle. And as you say, this is, it's a radical movement we're talking about. We're talking about a radical movement of change, and therefore we shouldn't be surprised that there are going to be barriers along the way and difficulties. I mean, my sense as a visitor to Scotland is I've looked at some of the materials that have been produced. I can't remember what it's called, but there's a framework for inclusion, which I've been recommending to other parts of the world through Twitter. And I think, there is a lot to build on in Scotland. My view is the policy is a bit over-centralised, and I think there needs to be more trust at the local level. I think, implicit in what I've said, I think teachers have got to be given more freedom. They've got to be trusted to make the right decisions, because they will more or less most of the time make the right decisions, and then, of course, they must be accountable. And I think people like educational psychologists and other consultants, you can be a catalyst for this. You're in a unique position because you don't belong to any particular people or groups. You're there to represent, as I said, to be the champion of the children and their families. So I think that the role of people like educational psychologists, and on my visits to Scotland, certainly compared with what happens south of the border, I'm very impressed by the significant impact that educational psychologists are having. You remind me of the English situation 30 years ago. A lot of my early work was with educational psychologists, and the first book I ever wrote was with an educational psychologist. And of course, sadly, the policy in England is such a mess. I'm sure you'll all be glad to hear that. The profession has become marginalised, sadly. But I think what I see and hear in Scotland is your profession is clearly a significant player in the game.
Mel, that's us. We've taken an hour of your time. Thank you so much for that. The chat, if you get a chance, please look at the chat pane, because you've certainly stimulated questions and comments. And Annie said something which I think is great. I'm going to keep the implications for EP's bullet points in my diary to prompt me to check I'm doing these things in my day-to-day practice.
There's another slide with some further reading. I don't think you can find that. This is highly recommended if you're having trouble sleeping.
Yeah. See, that's the thing. I am a sort of research geek. I would love that. So I will be looking at that. So all we can say is thank you very much. And thank you so much for your time. You've certainly made us think about all of this.